Beth, you can go.
Hello, I'm Beth Britton. I support Dementia Community with their communications work. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the second of our 2 March webinars. Before we get into the topic for today, I just wanted to briefly explain a bit more about Dementia Community. Dementia Community is a charitable community benefit society, a membership cooperative that provides learning and networking opportunities for the dementia care community. Dementia Community's core purpose is to connect and empower the dementia care community. Dementia Community's vision is of a world where all people within the dementia care community feel connected, informed, empowered, and purposeful, and are actively engaged in co-producing changes that improve everyone's experiences of dementia in care and in wider society. To sum up, if you're aware of the work of the National Dementia Action Alliance before it disbanded, we hope that Dementia Community is a replacement for the NDAA. Community members own a £1 community share in Dementia Community, and membership is open to everyone. So if you aren't already a member, do join us. There are both benefits and opportunities for all of our members. My colleague Beth Lang will put a link into the chat that will take you to our membership page. If you're having any difficulties in joining Dementia Community, do please message Beth or myself and we will aim to help. So, on to the topic for today's webinar: equality, diversity and inclusion in dementia care. The person comes first. I will introduce you to our fabulous speakers shortly, but just some brief housekeeping first. We are recording this webinar, so if you don't want your face on the recording, please turn your camera off. Please use the chat for your questions. We will have a Q&A and discussion after the presentation, and we will be keeping an eye on the chat. We hope to have some live participation too. So if you'd like to ask your question yourself at the end of the presentation, please raise your hand when we get to the Q&A section. Afterwards, Beth Lang will email you with the slides. The recording will also go onto our YouTube channel, Journal of Dementia Care, so do look out for that. We will also send you a feedback form afterwards, and we'd be really grateful if you could complete that and return it to us. So let's get started. Our speakers for today are Karan Jutlla from the University of Wolverhampton, David Truswell, Dementia Alliance for Culture and Ethnicity, and Jag Brar-Orgill, activist and former carer. Karan, David and Jag, welcome, thank you, and over to you.
Thank you. Can I just confirm the slides are up and everyone can see them?
I can. Hopefully everyone can. If you can't, do pop a message in the chat.
Fabulous. Thank you ever so much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Dementia Community, for inviting me to take part in this really important webinar this afternoon. As Beth has just said, I'm Karan Jutlla. I'm the head of the Centre for Applied and Inclusive Health Research and Dementia Lead at the University of Wolverhampton. I'm Associate Professor of Dementia Care and Inclusion, and my research interests in the challenge of dementia care, particularly in ethnic minority communities, as well as other underserved communities, has spanned for around 17 years, where I support policymakers, health and social care services to achieve EDI in dementia care, which is the focus of this webinar today. So during this webinar, I'm going to give you a brief overview of dementia and health inequalities in dementia care. I'd like to demystify what is meant by the term equality, diversity and inclusion, and how this links to the concept of intersectionality, providing further evidence of current issues in dementia care in different communities, by way of an example of some of the challenges faced by some underserved communities. And following that, I'll introduce the next speaker, Jag Brar-Orgill, who will be talking about her personal experience of caring for her mother as a South Asian Sikh woman. We'll then hear from David Truswell, who will be discussing creativity as a way of meeting the needs of people living with dementia who are traditionally underserved by services. We are anticipating that this will take us around 40 minutes with enough time for questions at the end. Now, I didn't want to assume that everybody participating in this webinar is familiar with the term dementia and what it means. So just to very briefly say that it's an umbrella term used to describe a set of symptoms that occur when the brain is damaged by certain diseases, including Alzheimer's disease and damage caused by a series of small strokes. Now, a person's symptoms in the brain very much depend upon where the damage has taken place. And you can see from this image that there are a range of symptoms associated with dementia, making it a very complex condition that requires due care and attention. So people experience more than things than just associated with memory loss. They can have issues with making sense of vision, movement and making sense of the environment around them, word finding, and coordination and body functions too. Why is it important to look at dementia? As this image clearly demonstrates, by 2051, we're expecting a huge increase in the numbers of people living with dementia. Already, this figure is close to that 1 million at 944,000. And this is very much a global issue. So we can see here that there's an estimated 139 million people that are going to be diagnosed with dementia by 2050 across the world. And what that says is that every 3 seconds, someone in the world develops dementia. Furthermore, a recent study published in the Lancet suggests that the number of people living with dementia is set to increase from an estimated 57 million in 2019 to 153 million by 2050. Shocking figures. Now, health inequalities in dementia care remain, and we know that they are there due to the evidence base. So we know, for example, when we think about dementia services for people living in the UK, that people from ethnic minority groups, LGBTQ plus communities, people living in rural locations tend not to present to services as much as others. We know that there are a high proportion of women in caring roles than men. We know that there's a lack of support for younger people, so people diagnosed under the age of 65, people with rarer forms of dementia, and people living with dementia and a learning disability or intellectual disability. We know that COVID-19 has caused some inequalities for people due to the lack of digital literacy skills. We know that in ethnic minority communities, there's inappropriate or inadequate support coupled with problems caused by language barriers, which often lead to late or misdiagnosis. We know that people who experience health inequalities are much less likely to be represented in health and social care research studies, including clinical trials, which means that some research studies could be questioned about how much they are a true reflection of what's happening in clinical practice. We know that if people are from socioeconomically deprived areas, that they tend to have poorer health outcomes in general. And we know from some research that there are experiences of subconscious bias and indirect and sometimes direct racial discrimination in services. So lots of evidence there to really highlight the urgent need for more targeted support to enable equitable access to support services for people with dementia and their family members and carers. And this really is where the EDI agenda comes in. So equality, diversity and inclusion, or diversity, equity and inclusion in other countries, refers to ensuring fair treatment and opportunity for all. Now, in my 15 years of delivering training in this area, I've often asked service managers and service providers to tell me, how do you know when you're being inclusive? And you will be surprised, or you won't be surprised, by the amount of times they say, because we treat everybody the same, or because we treat everybody equally. Now, as this image demonstrates, treating everybody equally means putting people with certain characteristics at an unfair disadvantage. Equity, on the other hand, involves making the necessary adaptations and adjustments required to ensure that everybody has a fair chance and opportunity to participate in whatever the set goal or activity is. And whilst we have a focus now on developing more equitable services, what we really ought to be doing is identifying the actual cause of the inequity and removing systemic barriers to achieve true liberation or justice. The reality of the world we live in, however, is where one gets more than what is needed, whilst the other gets less than what is needed. Thus, a huge disparity is created, and we know this from the evidence base that I've just talked through with you. Now, in the UK, we're the only country, if you like, the UK is, compared to other countries, that use the word equality rather than equity alongside diversity and inclusion to represent the fact that we have Equality Act, which states that it's against the law to discriminate against anyone because a number of what are called protected characteristics, as detailed here in this image. Now, because of the physical and sometimes cognitive disabilities associated with having a dementia, people living with this condition too fall under the Equality Act. However, it's not as simple as having simply one issue. So if you're living with dementia and you have a diagnosis of the condition, for example, you could argue that you too fall under the EDI agenda. However, some people have a diagnosis of dementia. They're also from a particular race or ethnicity, and they may also be somebody who's not heterosexual, and therefore they experience disadvantage or discrimination for a number of different reasons. And this concept is known as what us academics and some people call intersectionality. It takes into account that there are multiple layers of someone's identity that impacts upon their experiences. And so we encourage you to keep this and bear this in mind as we go throughout this webinar. Now, dementia does not discriminate. So if we were to take a closer look at dementia in ethnic minorities, for example, we know that there's a current estimate of nearly 25,000 people. Now, this estimate is low at the moment because this figure was taken over 10 years ago. And as you'll come on to realise, there are some other reasons which might indicate that we have estimated low numbers of people. But what's important to note here is that by 2051, this number is expected to grow to 172,000. So that's a 7-fold increase, which compares to over a 2-fold increase in the numbers of people with dementia across the whole UK population in the same time period. So this is telling us that people from ethnic minority backgrounds are not just getting older, but they are also growing in numbers. Furthermore, we know from recent research as well that the steepest increase is going to be expected in people from South Asian communities. So let's take a closer look at that so that we start to understand some of the complexities. And of course, this webinar cannot cover every single category across equality, diversity and inclusion. So we're using these examples by way to illustrate and help you understand some of those issues within working towards more inclusive communities. So what do we know very quickly about dementia in South Asian communities then? We know that there are higher risk factors, so this might explain some of the high predictions in dementia in South Asian communities, and these associated with higher incidences of hypertension, diabetes and stroke. We know that there are lower levels of knowledge and awareness about dementia. We know that there's no word for dementia in certain languages. So in Hindi, Urdu, Punjabi, Bengali, and Bangladeshi, there isn't a word that translates into dementia, and the word that is used translates into memory loss. And so with that comes further complications, because we know that dementia is so much more than just memory loss. Because people don't understand dementia, they often see it as a mental health problem. With that comes a stigma of mental health. Clearly, such issues then remain hidden, and we have low dementia diagnosis in such communities. And when people do present to services, it's often in a crisis situation. So there's a huge need for early intervention. We know that there's a lack of culturally appropriate assessment tools, which often lead to misdiagnosis. That services are often called Caucasian-centric because they're not culturally inclusive. We also know that there's a lack of culturally appropriate psychosocial interventions to support people to live well with their dementia. And of course, naturally, this is going to lead to a heavy amount of work on carers as resources to support their loved one to live well. From a service perspective, based on my own work that I've done with organisations, there's still this real fear of the unknown. There are still healthcare workers and professionals that are frightened about being politically correct. As one care worker said, I'm sometimes frightened to ask in case I say the wrong thing. There are still assumptions about community support, that South Asian families look after their own, don't they? There's a heavy reliance on family for information, and quite often healthcare professionals say that language is seen as the biggest barrier, and this is why they have to rely on the family for the information that they require. I just wanted to share a couple of quotes with you from some of my latest research projects about people giving their community perspectives and really highlighting this notion that one size does not fit all. Balvinder Kaur, aged 32 years, cares for her mother, said, I still can't believe that services still think that all Asian people are the same. They sent me a Gujarati speaking care worker when my mum speaks Punjabi. They are two completely different languages, but in their eyes, we are South Asian, and they sent me a South Asian care worker. Harbans Kaur, aged 70 years, cares for her husband, removed him from daycare because when he used to go to daycare, they just assumed that he wanted Asian food and that he wouldn't be interested in the fish and chips they served every Friday. But we've always eaten fish and chips on a Friday. The children used to love it. Little things like this kept happening, and I felt bad for him. Here you can see that the organisation's intention was good, but in doing so, unintentionally excluded this gentleman, and we can see that the cultural assumptions that are made from organisations when trying to deliver care. This leads me nicely on to the next speaker, Jagdish Brar-Orgill, who is one of the participants actually from these research projects that I just presented, who's going to share her lived experience of caring for her mother who lived with a diagnosis of mixed dementia. Over to you, Jag.
Thank you, Karen. Hello, I'm Jagdish, Jag for short. I gave up my career to become Mum's unpaid carer for over 6 years. Mum lived in her own home of 40 years plus, from a bustling house full of life with 3 sons and their families living within a 2 to 10 mile vicinity. This gradually changed when Dad passed away 23 years ago. Mum was left living on her own as she didn't want to be a burden on her 5 children. The pain and desperation I endured in ensuring Mum was looked after in her own home was just on an excruciating level and exacerbated during COVID. Stress and grief were my everyday norm. The long distance driving of 400 miles every 10 days over 6 years, chasing the disparate services constantly and sourcing private, culturally appropriate carers had such a detrimental effect on my physical and mental health, not to mention my marriage. It's difficult to encapsulate my struggle over the last 7 years in such a short period of time. There were just so many layers. It was hard enough watching Mum disappear under the fogginess of dementia, as well as advocating for her on every front possible. I feel I was robbed of quality time with Mum whilst chasing services and micromanaging carers when I wasn't able to look after Mum physically. Mum was officially diagnosed with Alzheimer's and vascular dementia in 2017. In hindsight, it's now evident Mum was presenting signs in 2013 or even before, but her symptoms were dismissed as just being lonely and depressed. 2017 was also a year after we adopted our amazing daughter after 19 years of fertility treatments. Our daughter also has a rare condition resulting in physical impairments, which continue to present their own challenges. She's grown up around dementia and has seen me break down numerous times. There was no dementia pathway, let alone person-centred dementia care in Mum's borough, so I was the coordinator for all the fragmented services as it became a full-time job. I was faced with mixed messages from the GP telling me there was no care in the community, yet being told otherwise by other professionals. So much conflicting information as it was imperative to keep Mum in her home full of so many memories spanning up to 50 years. Being a long-distance carer, I fell in between the cracks and wasn't eligible for official support or an assigned admiral nurse. Believe me, I tried. I'm resourceful and proactive and found nuggets of advice from various acquaintances I met through networking. I left no stone unturned to source culturally appropriate carers, from contacting gurdwaras, Sikh organisations, high-profile Sikhs in the public domain, even approaching women in supermarkets. Yes, I was that desperate. I trained, managed and guided 30 Sikh carers who knew nothing about dementia, sometimes on an hourly basis. Only 3 were compassionate and trustworthy. I recall being told by a senior official in 2016 within the mental health team that it wasn't worth raising my concerns with CCG, why there were no resources serving the South Asian community as it comprised of white middle-class people who wouldn't listen to my issues. I never did get the time to follow up my call, as I was constantly firefighting. I approached the local MP, all to no avail, even contacting Teepa Snow in America, whether her 10-minute nuggets of dementia training videos were available in Punjabi for the carers. I was told on 2 occasions by a clinician from the palliative care team within the last 6 months of Mum's life that she didn't warrant a visit from them, despite being under their care for 2.5 years. I feel I had a black mark against my name every time I called a service. I had a district nurse put the phone down on me when I reached out for support. Different community matrons being introduced after a year instead of the continuity of the 2 Mum had become familiar with, one of which made inappropriate comments to me. All the services I'd fought for, district nurses, community matrons, stopped making home visits in November 2021, which I oversaw physically or remotely. Why? At such a crucial point when Mum's health was on a downward trajectory. The pressure sore was deemed as a moisture sore in November 2021. Community matrons didn't reinstate their weekly visits. I had to contact the director to request a district nurse to visit. I was administering Oromorph as Mum was in that much pain. She was referred back into mental health services as she was displaying psychotic episodes in November 2021. Little did I know it was the beginning of the end. In 2020, it took me 6 weeks of constant chasing to get a clinician from the SALT team to visit Mum after she had a full teeth extraction in January 2020, followed by overflow 2 weeks later as she was prescribed cocodamol and paracetamol by her GP to manage the pain, despite being aware Mum had suffered from chronic constipation for decades. Mum was bedridden after this. The same happened after Mum was hospitalised with aspiration during COVID. Despite requesting a home visit, I was informed on the morning I arrived, while still recovering from COVID, it would be a video link, which just aggravated and confused Mum. Prior to this, I was told the tone of my email was aggressive. This clinician went on to shout at me during the video consultation with Mum. Just so many errors from services I'd fought for, not to mention the inappropriate comments made by some health professionals when visiting Mum. Empathy doesn't cost anything. I learnt about dementia the hard way and knew every minute detail about my mum's health as I was across it literally 24/7. Mum was hospitalised 8 times in 5 years, and I stayed with her for the duration. I saw how information was often lost in translation by so many departments, as NHS resources are so stretched. I've had to explain to so many healthcare professionals why putting Mum in a care home would fast-track her to the inevitable, and why Mum had reverted to her native tongue, having spoken good English. Why culturally appropriate care is essential in terms of language, music and food. Latterly, I was diagnosing Mum and knew when Mum had an aspirating attack, sepsis, and oral thrush, which on a previous occasion had been overlooked by professionals, and yet I wasn't listened to or believed. I was told Mum's dementia had progressed, resulting in loss of speech, which I was aware of, but I just knew it wasn't that. I finally managed to get a GP to visit who confirmed Mum had mouth thrush as a result of taking antibiotics. I knew that and should have known better, but juggling so many things, I'd overlooked it. Mum started talking once this had cleared, albeit very quietly. Throughout the 6 years, I knew Mum's food and fluid intake. If she had engaged in activities, I was also tweaking her bowel meds and the morphine. The lymphedema I'd flagged up with palliative care in November 2021 was never addressed. I couldn't even cuddle Mum in the last week of her life in hospital as her limbs were so swollen. I wasn't told Mum was end of life. despite asking so many questions. Yet this time, it was as if I was paralyzed in pursuing answers, as I was just on autopilot. I didn't even make it to PALS for the first time, as I was a regular visitor during previous admissions. I just wasn't supported. Mum shouldn't have been in that ward. I don't blame the staff, as they just weren't trained in end-of-life care. Mum hadn't eaten since the Saturday, and there was no urine output on the Thursday. The cannula had become detached as the machine was beeping all day on the Thursday. Despite me reporting this, I should have known what the signs meant, but I was so focused on the mouth thrush, as it had been overlooked on a previous occasion. A member from the hospital palliative care team arrived 5 days after Mum had been admitted, and hadn't liaised with the main palliative care team from the hospice, whom I was still liaising with on that fateful morning. She told me Mum had approximately 6 to 12 months to live. My response was, Mum's hardly got 6 days, let alone 6 weeks. But my words just weren't registering with me. Mum passed away the next day in May 2022 in hospital, not at home. I had to persuade the GP to visit 3 weeks prior to this. He was more concerned about my mental health. Mum had an infection which led to pneumonia and passed away from it, as I predicted to her GP. Mum was denied end-of-life care despite being under their care for 2.5 years. It was painful for Mum and traumatic for me and my sister. Carers like me just aren't listened to or heard despite being across our loved ones' care 24/7. I'm still processing the last 7 years and trying to manage PTSD. My heart goes out to carers who are unable to advocate for their loved ones and are unable to navigate the adult social care system, falling at the first hurdle. It was difficult enough for me, but my tenacity and inner strength pulled me through. I was lucky to be involved in the Crisis Behind Closed Doors campaign with Alzheimer's Society a few years ago and met various MPs who were of the opinion our communities look after our own, a myth that needs to be dispelled. Sadly, this narrative is what large organisations still believe. While some families may look after their elderly parents, many don't. There is no word for dementia in our community apart from being referred to as mad or crazy, as it's such a taboo subject. People can live well with dementia given the love and support of their families. Mum was abandoned by her family and relatives, apart from me and my sister. I endured conscious and unconscious bias, and yet if I questioned health professionals about Mum's health, as a woman of colour, I was automatically deemed as aggressive. I was already experiencing so many layers of inequalities and challenges within my own community as a woman. I was my mum's voice. My experience was that dementia is Caucasian-centric. It isn't and shouldn't be. Dementia doesn't discriminate. Sadly, some services do. I know many carers before me from marginalised communities have voiced similar concerns over the years, and yet nothing has changed. We are still an afterthought, an hour, day, or a month afforded to highlight the challenges faced by marginalised communities, then forgotten about. It still appears we're a tick box exercise or quota for organisations and services. I don't think I'll see a change in my lifetime. The above really just skims the surface. Respect and dignity whilst caring for our loved ones, especially during end-of-life care, shouldn't have to be fought for or be denied. Sadly, my beautiful mum's end wasn't met with dignity or respect. I'm still fighting for my dear mum. She didn't deserve such a traumatic end. I truly believe lived carers' experiences like mine should be an integral part of research and when commissioning services. I'm really hoping healthcare professionals and services will understand the challenges faced by our communities and will adapt their services accordingly to help support underserved communities so that few carers experience the desperation and breakdown that I and many other carers have endured. We may not have official qualifications, but we are across our loved ones' care 24/7. We are carers by experience and need to be heard and shown understanding. Inclusivity and representation matter. Thank you for listening.
Okay. pause there. I can't hear anything, I'm afraid.
Oh, we can hear you, David. I can anyway.
Right, I'm going to go then. I think it's always quite kind of hearing Joe, because I've had given counter experience before, gives one pause for thought. So we all have, however, moving on with the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about dementia, creativity and reminiscence, just to let you know the focus of what I'm going to talk about is talking about some of the work we're calling Dementia in Dub, as well as being creating a support network called the Dementia Alliance for Culture and Ethnicity that was mentioned at the beginning. I'm also involved with a number of different smaller organisations looking at working with dementia from a particular perspective, most of those perspectives involving minority communities. So let's kick off really with the next slide, which is what I'm going to talk about in the 10 minutes or so here. Covers these particular highlighted themes. One is to challenge the idea that people living with dementia who previously, from being diagnosed with dementia, have been creators of one form or another, who often feel that they're now seen as being expected to stop being creative. It may well be that the dementia has an impact on their former creativity, and certainly in terms of some of their ability to continue with particular practices or techniques that are part of their creativity. But I think often they feel under pressure to actually just stop whatever it is, painting, playing guitar, producing records, etc. And also equally challenging is for people living with dementia who may not themselves have been or seen themselves as creators, who, having had a diagnosis of dementia, often are seen as effectively having no aspirations. There can be nothing new that they can possibly learn, and also kind of what's the point in encourage them to be creative, because it often the narrative is all about the devastation and loss that people experience as part of dementia, without any room for looking at the aspirations that people have, because people just have aspirations, whether they've got dementia or not. Often people with dementia, again, regardless of their actual capacity, from the moment that they get a diagnosis of dementia, find that they lose choice and agency. And one of the things they often lose choice and agency about is their involvement in creativity and socializing across the board. And finally, what I'm going to illustrate is how telling individual stories, as it would, in my view, cuts right through to the whole issue of individual care and also culturally appropriate care, because it's about what works for individuals in terms of telling their story in their way, in a way that makes sense for them, and not least because also that may well involve not having to talk about dementia, but actually talk about other things in their lives that can be much more important to them in terms of their sense of where they are or where they're going. Can we move on to the next slide? There's an illustration of one of the projects that we did that during the COVID, which was all done remotely, where we invited people across the country through their different community organisation contacts to take a picture of their everyday environment, one day, every day for 28 days, because we sent them one of these, I've just seen them, these kind of plastic disposable cameras that you can take a picture every day and then wind it on and take another picture on the next day, and then send the photos into our central collection point, where we're working with another allied organisation to create physical photo books. So what you can see there is a picture of a physical photo book that everybody received at the end of the project, and also we got archive copies of these photo books, and the photo books have physical pictures in them of their day-to-day life, assembled in the order that they took them. And also inside the photo book is a little kind of detachable, it's almost like a kind of a book in itself, but that simply has a few words by the person who took the photo of what the project or taking the photos meant to them. So if you'd move on to the next slide, please. Here we have one of the photo books taken, I'm probably going to mispronounce it, by Mrs. Shen Hua-Hui. And as I was saying earlier, all these photographs are taken during the COVID period. And Mrs. Hui, in this period, was essentially confined to just one room of her house. So her photo book comprises of photographs taken every day in the room that she was living in over that 28 days of the photographs. The thing about Mrs. Hui is that as a result of her dementia, she actually lost her ability to use English language. And so she was basically only communicating, and even then in a limited way, with her granddaughter, who was supporting her, if I recall correctly, in her own native language. What's important about the photo book that she created is you don't have to know Cantonese or Mandarin to appreciate the importance of these photographs in the life of somebody who was having to live in one room during the COVID period. And in Mrs. Hui's photo book, the little panel in which she describes what she thinks about this, it's all written in Chinese script, which we haven't translated. One of the reasons for not translating it is for the photo book itself to give the person who's looking at it as accurate a sense as possible through this particular medium of what her life is like for her. And part of what her life is like for her is people who can't speak Chinese language can't communicate with her without a translator. So we've represented that in the photo book. An important element of what we were doing with the photo book was to encourage people to kind of recognise that this was a creative endeavour that we were sharing with them, and that while we hoped that it would have a therapeutic benefit, our principal aim was to provide an opportunity for people to be creators, particularly people who maybe didn't think themselves as folk who created photo books with their own photographs. Move on to the next slide, please. If we can play this track, this is another illustration of how we've been approaching creativity and living with dementia through a cultural lens. So if we can, yeah, here we go. Hopefully the sound's working.
It's 3 o'clock in the morning and the world it gently sleeps. Dementia in dub.
It's 3 o'clock in the morning and the world it gently sleeps. To me the night's still young, though I want to move my feet. I take a trip to banjos, the tunes boom through the door. Please let me in quick, sir, I need to hit the floor. Skinny Joe, he says hello and tells me to go on inside. The club is already full, the crowd moves like a tide. The music is blaring, the floor throbs like a quake. I'm in reggae heaven and it keeps me wide awake. U-boys toasting, Scratch Perry's dubbing, every style is here. The sounds are mesmerising, I don't need no beer. It's 6 a.m, it's time to go. I say goodbye to my friends. Nights like this, they go too quick, why do they have to end? The birds they are singing and almost to a reggae beat. My mind is still blown away as I stroll along my street. And now the night is over, it's time to go to bed. The sweet reggae night that I've just had, it is replayed in my head. Now I have dementia, these memories fade away. It cannot take the reggae though, which gets me through the day.
It's 3 o'clock in the morning and the world it gently sleeps. La 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 la. Dementia in dub. La 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 la. Dementia in dub. La 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 la. It's 3 o'clock in the morning and the world it gently sleeps. La 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 la. It's 3 o'clock in the morning and the world it gently sleeps. La 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 la.
Yeah. So Ronald, who produced that at the Stingray Studios, is a long-standing music producer. We can move on to the next slide. I'll just talk about that. And his colleague there, John Doherty, they met because they're both dementia diarists. But Ronald's been a creator for most of his life, and obviously it was a shock to him when he developed mixed dementia as a result of a stroke a few years ago. And one of the huge issues for him was coming to terms with the fact that it wouldn't be as easy for him to produce music in the same way as he was able to previously, but still retains a high degree of skill in music production. And John said he'd never written a poem before, so Ronald persuaded John to write this poem about reggae music, because they're both huge reggae music fans, and the conversation that we've had, that's me and Ronald, but Ronald's also had with John, is about the role of reggae music in UK social history for quite a few of us who are now at the sort of in our late 60s or early 70s. And we created that as an example of a way in which somebody who's living with dementia, who thought they weren't a creator, was unable to be a creator, and somebody who had been a creator to a great degree, before they were living with dementia, was coming to terms with not being able to be quite so much of an extensive creator as he was able to be before, but still able to kind of create something fairly wonderful. One of the things that, again, as a personal view from the various projects that I've been involved in the past few years, it's clear to me that there are particular benefits, which I hope the two examples I've just given can illustrate, about how even with very, very small interventions and pieces of work, you can create small wins for people which make a difference to their day, particularly if they're living with dementia and being told, you know, everything's over, there's nothing you can do. But to create a very small win in somebody's day, and also as part of that process, allow them to make new choices. They make new choices, in this case, by having a go with the disposable camera. John makes a new choice by having a go at writing a poem in these examples. As a result of these kinds of things, and much other things we've been up to, this changes the relationships, in my view, between people living with dementia and people who aren't, whether the people who aren't living with dementia are carers, or just people who just happen to know folk living with dementia, or whether they're care professional staff or clinicians, because suddenly folk have to deal with the fact that people who they may have previously believed have a very, very limited set of options to discover and try out new options. And it certainly increases the confidence of people living with dementia in trying out stuff in their daily lives and feeling that they can develop new skills. I think particularly from the photography project, one of the strong pieces of feedback that we got was from carers who often had to support people living with dementia creating their photo books, was a completely new idea of what the person that, you know, they lived with obviously all of their life could or couldn't do, or was prepared to try, and new conversations arising out of the photographs about things that maybe people hadn't talked about before, or not talked about in the same way before. And I think all these things can combine to create a new perspective in the life of people who are living with dementia, and those who are involved with enabling that life to be as good as it can possibly be. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So in conclusion, then, I'd say that we can use creativity as an approach to helping people to tell their individual story in a way that makes sense to them. And part of helping them to tell that story in a way that makes sense to them is to be able to reach into what their cultural roots and cultural experiences mean to them. And to go back to the example right there from Karen, yeah, fine, it's important, the Asian food, but it's also important that the fish and chips on Friday are part of that individual's personal experience. Some other resources I'd like to commend to you there, a couple of them available on the internet. There's obviously the photo book project. There's more photo books that you can find on our website for the photo book project. There's a lot more video resources you can find on the Dementia Alliance of Culture and Ethnicity website there, www.demace.com. Please do buy my book, which is very cheap, on Amazon. Of course, supporting people living with dementia in Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. It's even cheaper, I think, in the Kindle version. I'm not making any money out of it, but I do think it's well worth, I am told, reading it, because it's very accessible as a read and has lots of stories about people's personal experiences. And I'd also like to commend to you, although you don't chase it over on the internet, a document called Think Local Act Personal, Personalisation in Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. Myself and a colleague produced a couple of years ago. There's a couple of examples in there where we explore and talk in detail with people who are running services specifically with minority ethnic communities, supporting them living with dementia. And in those accounts, I think there are some useful examples of how to get it right. So I think that's all from me. Yes, it is.
Thank you, David. I know that we've got probably lots of questions, so all of us really have a series of questions for you all to think about, whether you are an organisation or a service or an initiative. Inclusion is beyond just ethnic minorities, but something that needs to be person-centred, whether it's because of someone's race and ethnicity, like I spoke about at the beginning, or whether it's because they're from an LGBTQ+ community, or they're just living with a diagnosis of dementia, to have a think about how inclusive and meaningful and engaging as an organisation you are being. So I think we're going to stop there to hand over to the audience, because I know we went slightly over time in true Karan, Jag and David fashion. Beth, let me know when you want me to stop sharing the screen.
Oh, that's super. Thank you so much, Karan. Thank you, David. Thank you, Jag, for just a fantastically informative session. So much to unpick. Yeah, do please stop sharing your screen, Karan. That would be great. So just in the chat, first and foremost, just some thanks, really, I think, and extremely well deserved. I think everyone was really struck by your story, Jag. I think it resonated with our audience. It resonated with me. I cared for my dad. I didn't have the cultural challenges that you had, but I had an awful lot of challenges. The aspirating and all of that was the last 4 years of our lives. So I absolutely really sort of aligned with what you said. Karan, you gave us a fantastic overview of the picture in the dementia world and those specific issues around ethnicity, around culture. And then David, I just love that strapline. Use creativity to tell your story in a way that makes sense to the person. And that applies to everybody. And it is one of the most accessible things we can do, non-pharmacological intervention, where we can use creative approaches to enable everyone to tell their stories. And that's just some really powerful kind of takeaway messages. From the chat, let me just have a quick look. So both Barbara and Kate said thank you so much, Jag, for sharing your story. Sue has reminded us there is an article on the photo book project in the January-February edition of JDC. And Barbara said it's been such a rich and powerful webinar, and she commends her thanks to you guys. If anyone's got any questions, please do put your hand up or pop them in the chat. I think those questions you shared at the end, Karan, are just so powerful. How inclusive is your practice? If you could put kind of a temperature gauge on what you see on the front line, would you say we've made some progress on some of those questions? Obviously, you can't speak for every service, but would you feel from what you see in frontline practice that we are making progress?
Personally, Beth, the change that I've seen the most is that people are starting to talk more about inclusivity than they did before. So that's been a change in itself, and people are genuinely wanting to know how to do it. We're starting to move towards co-production, and I think a lot of what David spoke about in working with people, you know, through their creativity to give them that meaningful role and purpose is a part of co-production. And we're starting to see more co-production in services, because that's how you're inclusive, isn't it? You need to ask people what they want in order to work with them to create a service that's going to meet their particular needs, rather than think we know what they need and then develop something for somebody. So I'd say that's the change that I'm starting to see. We're a far cry away from inclusive services, but we are starting to move more towards co-production. And I do feel like we're starting to hear the voices of people with dementia and people with dementia from underrepresented communities a little bit more now.
Super, thank you. Bryony says, thank you for the fantastic webinar, Jag. Thank you for sharing your lived experience. It was incredibly powerful. David, thank you for sharing the video of John and Ronald and the fantastic photo series. And thank you, Karen, for the overview. And Kate says, careful listening is so imperative. Thank you, Karen. You've popped a fabulous link there into the chat for everybody. And I agree with Julie, those questions are so helpful. If there's one part of the presentation that you could really go away and action, that would probably be it. Go through those questions. How inclusive is your practice? Share them with health and social care services that you are engaged with. Jag, I'd like to come to you if you wouldn't mind, just while we see if we've got any other questions from our audience, and say, you shared so much of us and so much of what you went through. It was so painful and so difficult. And it sounds like you became everything from a meds expert to a care expert and everything else in between. If there's one message you could leave service providers with, whether it's the NHS, whether it's social care, what would it be? What would be your message that says, you know what, you need to listen and you need to focus on this?
I think it would be just listen to the carer. I was honestly, I was so desperate, but I didn't have the qualifications. I just wasn't listened to. I wasn't aggressive. I wasn't angry. I was just trying to brief professionals every day. Well, you know, whenever somebody visited, this is what's happened. I had email trails. I had everything, but I don't know what it was about me, but I just wasn't heard. And nurses would come in and they just wanted to do their thing. But it's about person-centered care. Mum didn't have any veins. You know, there were so many problems trying to get veins, the phlebotomist, and it was just a catalogue of errors. It was just awful. And yet, what was the point in saying anything? And when I did, you know, is that why the community matrons stopped visiting? Because they were complaining about me? There are so many things. You just can't win, you know, so I had to deal with it all. And I think the bottom line is listen to the carer. They really know everything about that person.
Absolutely. I think there's a real bottom line in all of this, isn't there? That there's one part of listen to the care and the other part is listen to the person, while the person can articulate, while they can have those creative approaches. We absolutely must capture everything we can through every stage of a person's dementia. Jag, I totally hear you. My dad had care plans made without his our consent. He had feeding tubes shoved down his nose that were never going to work. We had lots and lots of issues. I think there's a real cultural difficulty with listening to families across.
And I think even in MD, I didn't even have a care plan. I had to ask for one. I had to, honestly, every stage, I had to instigate everything. Nothing was given to me. I had to fight for everything.
It's a great shame. We had the triangle of care many, many years ago, and it made it very clear that there should be a partnership in that triangle between everybody, and it's not been fulfilled, certainly not across the board. Anyway, Julie says, see the care as an equal partner, it pays dividends to all, and it absolutely does. And I think the message for professionals is where you involve families, you will also deliver better care and support as well. Is there any final messages you guys would like to share with us? I know we're out of time, so I don't know if anyone's got anything else they would like to share. Then I think I'll bring this to a close. Just a huge thank you to Jag, to David, to Karen for your time, for your expertise today. We've really enjoyed hearing from you, and it's been incredibly valuable. And of course, this recording will be on YouTube for many other people, hopefully to learn from what we've learned from today. So thank you all so much for your time. And then just a heads up for our next webinar. So on Monday, the 22nd of April, so it's a Monday this time, 2 till 3, we have Thrive, the benefits of gardening and green spaces for people with dementia and how to provide year-round accessibility. Do join us for that. The booking is on our website. You have the links as well in the chat. And thank you very much to our guests and to all of our audience for joining us today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.